Joseph is an Episcopal priest. He was recently ordained several years ago. He is currently serving as the Episcopal chaplain at Princeton University. And then on Sunday mornings only, he serves at St. Paul's in Chestnut Hill. Joseph is a DPhil candidate at the University of Oxford in science and religion. And so this is a subject that he cares deeply about. A little bit about his autobiography. He started at his university at college studying science. He studied neuroscience, and he double majored. He was one of those, and he got a degree in religion or philosophy as well. So he's always kind of cared about this, and so he's brought it into his priesthood in a really helpful way in the service of the church. He served on the Executive Council Committee on Science, Technology, and Faith. That's a committee that the presiding bishop invites people to serve on to help the Episcopal Church think about different set issues. And so for Joseph, it was science and religion. So without further ado, our speaker, Joseph.
I asked her not to give one of those lengthy introductions, but she insisted. It really is wonderful to be with you this morning. We hardly ever get to worship together, so it's really great just to have the opportunity. I'm breaking things left and right. You'll never invite me back. It really is wonderful to be with you, and if we can get the technology working, then I'll show you some of the slides that I had presented for you today. I want to begin with the supposition that there is a broad perception about the conflict of science and religion. And whenever I've given talks like this to various church groups, I always ask, is this a perception that you share? And everyone in the room says, no, not us. But I'm curious, has anybody ever heard about, engaged with friends or neighbors about the conflict of science and religion? Is this the sort of thing that, okay, so good. One of my first slides here is to give you a research study from the Pew Center. It does a lot of sociological studies, surveys about religion and culture. One of the recent ones is in perceptions of the conflict between science and religion. And there's some fascinating stuff that emerged from that study last done in 2015. One is that a majority of Americans think that there is a conflict between science and religion, including Roman Catholics and mainline Protestants. 55% of mainline Protestants who answered a survey about the conflict between science and religion said, yes, there is a conflict. 57% of Roman Catholics surveyed said that there is a conflict between science and religion. Overall, as the United States, 67% of Americans think there is a conflict between science and religion. But I think that most significantly, those who do not affiliate with any particular religious tradition, the atheists, the Gnostics, the nuns, duns, N-O-N-E-S, I should say, no religion, nobody's in heaven. The so-called duns, the people who have left religion behind, and the espionars, the spiritual but not religious. An overwhelming 79% of those surveyed in that, which is the fastest growing cohort in American religion today, say that there is a distinct conflict between science and religion. Why do I say that? Because I think that us thinking through these subjects of the relationship between science and religion is really important for our witness, for us living out the evangelical imperative of our baptismal vows and spreading the gospel of Jesus Christ. To the extent that our culture views science and religion as locked in inevitable conflict, and where only one of them is going to come out as a winner, a lot of folks are going to opt for the science because it's something you can trust. And they're going to say, well, I can't believe in science and that God stuff at the same time. So I think it's really important for us to think through this subject together. There's a lot that I can say about this, but what I wanted to do is to try to ground this in the person that I know best, which is Francis Bacon. And at this point, I would be showing you a slide of a slice of bacon, and you would all laugh. then I would click the slide and it would go to Kevin Bacon, and I would say, not that Bacon. Then I would click the slide and it would go to a picture of the Screaming Pope. Have you ever seen this painting? It's the other Francis Bacon. Whenever I'm at a cocktail party and people say, what did you do your dissertation on? I'll say Francis Bacon, and they say, oh, I really love Francis Bacon's work, that he's such a great artist. And then I say, oh, I'm sorry, not that Francis Bacon, the other Francis Bacon. And they say, oh, that's nice. And then they conversation. So now I click to the slide about Francis Bacon, who lived in 1561, died in 1626. A philosopher, a statesman. Has anybody ever heard of Francis Bacon or read any of his stuff? Yeah, Liz, unfortunately, has sat through this presentation 12 times. So, actually, why don't you give it, Liz? And I imagine that you probably encountered him at some point, whether in high school or college, in English, right? Do you remember where you encountered him? Anybody? You get extra purgatory points if you say it again.
College English.
College English, right? I'm often reading his essays. People often ask me what are some of the best books of his to read. And I'll say the essays, because they're these short essays on a variety of different subjects of truth, of beauty, of various things. And it's such a wonderful example of this flowering Elizabethan prose. He wrote several major works and is often credited as being the father of modern science. He's one of the people that advocated for a methodological approach to natural philosophy, what he called experimental natural philosophy. And that really gave rise to our scientific method. What I'll do here, this will be a little bit more difficult. You'll have to listen to these quotes. Unfortunately, I don't have them all memorized. But what I want to argue to you this morning, and really the whole basis of my thesis, is that Bacon is often regarded as this figure who foresaw the secular scientific age in which we are now living. And in fact was arguing for that against religion. And indeed, you'll see in his works a lot of stuff about invectives against superstition and false religion and these sorts of things. My argument, and you can tell me if I persuaded you at the end of this session, is that Bacon was not a covert atheist arguing for the replacement of religion and for science to emerge as the true authority in these matters. But he was an Anglican who was influenced by his time, by the Reformation, and that he used actually a lot of that rhetoric, which ended up being, unfortunately, he ended up, all of this stuff that he says that's sort of against religion is not against religion as on the whole, but is against the Roman Catholic Church in particular. In this time of this heated rhetoric between the Roman Church and the Church of England. So he also, in the same breath, talks about quote-unquote true religion. And what he means by that is the establishment of the religion that was practiced in the Church of England. I will hasten to add here that I'm not sure how pious Bacon was. There is a wonderful letter that his mother is writing to his brother, Nicholas Bacon, where she says, I'm really worried about Francis. I don't think he's been to church since last Easter. We can all relate to that, right? So I don't necessarily want to suggest that he's this deeply pious person, but I do want to suggest that he was a creature of his time, and that he used theology to be the frame for the entire vision that he had for the place of science in society. And my basic contention to you this morning is that by looking at this one figure, we can see how nuanced the relationship was between science as it was emerging and theology as it was practiced, and that there is a close relationship between the two. And I'm just arguing this point by looking at this one historical figure. So again, at this point, I pull up a slide where I say what Bacon's main invective is against, and this would be really funny because there's an armchair lounge here. And I would say armchair philosophers, right? Do you know what I'm saying when I say armchair philosophers? It's sort of this vision of the person who just sits back in their study all day long, that we could invent and execute some technologies that we could use in order to achieve our place in the human order. Yet nevertheless, chiefly, that labor and travel which is described by the sweat of the brows, more than of the body. That labor which is described by the sweat of the brow and more than of the body. For as Solomon saith excellently, the fool putteth more strength, but the wise man considereth which way. Signifying the election of the need to be more material than the multiplication of the endeavor. I don't really know what that means. But what is he saying here? This is directly out of the curse, right? Where God says to Adam, in order to achieve getting some fruit from the ground now, you're going to have to labor by the sweat of your brow. Bacon is turning this into a really interesting twist. And by this he means the intellectual endeavor, by the sweat that would come out of our foreheads when we're thinking really hard. That's never happened to me. Maybe I haven't thought hard enough. But he's saying that actually we should devote ourselves to, instead of, as Solomon says, just putting more strength, just trying to go at it. Instead of trying to lift that huge rock out of your garden just by brute strength, we should step back and think, I wonder if I could invent some kind of technology that would help me relate to nature better. Does that make sense? It's a really interesting twist on this sweat of the brow, but it's all within this, what I want to call a theological imagination, a theological vision of the world. And here's a wonderful picture of a farmer that's sweat of the brow. Here comes in Bacon's vision for what we call the scientific method, where we have a theory and we test that theory and then we look at the results of our experiment and then we further refine our theories. Do you remember that from 4th grade? Some of you may be scientists here who do that all the time. This is what he's talking about, that we have to develop these sorts of helps and these sorts of technologies to aid this intellect which has been marred by sin. Here's another quote about recovering our place within the order of creation. And here's a wonderful picture of a human at the top of the pyramid and all these other animals beneath. Let no man presume to check the liberality of God's gifts, who, as was said, hath set the world in man's heart. So God is a good gift giver. Comes straight out of the Gospels, right? So don't think that God isn't wanting to give each and every one of us wonderful gifts, to be liberal, to be lavish in the bestowing of gifts. But yet evermore, it must be remembered that the least part of knowledge passeth to man by this so large a charter from God, must be subject to that use for which God hath granted it. So this wonderful gift of knowledge that God has given to us has to be used for the purposes for which God granted it, which is to the benefit and relief of the state and society of man. Once again, to relieve the suffering of the human condition that has come as a result of the fall. That's the whole point of God giving us knowledge. For otherwise, all manner of knowledge becometh malign and serpentine, and therefore as carrying the quality of a serpent's sting. I promise I didn't set this up in light of the gospel Old Testament today. And malice, it maketh the mind of man to swell. Anybody know where that's coming from? From Corinthians. The swelling of the mind. As Scripture saith excellently, knowledge bloweth up, but charity buildeth up. What is he saying here? Does anybody get this? 24 preparatory points for this one. So God has given us the gift of knowledge, but we have to use knowledge to the correct end, which is not so that we can walk around and say, I got all these fine degrees from this fine university. That's not the point. Because if the point of learning is just to make ourselves look good, then it already feeds into that proclivity that we all have to be prideful, right? Knowledge puffs up, But the point of knowledge, of the gift of knowledge that God has given us, is to try to use it to relieve the human condition, to relieve the suffering of our neighbors. And therefore, it is not the pleasure of curiosity, nor the quiet of resolution, nor the raising of the spirit, nor the victory of wit, nor the faculty of speech, nor the lucre of profession, nor the ambition of honor or fame, nor the enablement of business that are the true ends of knowledge. None of that stuff is what knowledge is for. Some of these things being more worthy than others, but all inferior and degenerate. But it is the restitution and reinvesting, in great part, not the entire thing, but in great part, the restitution and reinvesting of man to the sovereignty and power, for whensoever he shall be able to call the creatures by their true names, he shall again command them, which he had in the first state of creation. Alright? So you're seeing these themes emerging over and over again. So the point of knowledge is for us to be able to reclaim the place that we once had within the pre-lapsarian. That's a 232 points in Scrabble, if you can break it all. The pre-fall garden, to reclaim the place that we once had. So knowledge helps us get to that point where we can, quote-unquote, call the creatures by their name in order to command the natural order back into order, out of the chaos that has ensued after the fall, and ultimately to relieve the suffering that is endemic in the created order as it currently exists. Here's another example of the way that the theological imagination has suffused Bacon's thought, and his use of the two books analogy. Our Savior saith, you err not, knowing the Scriptures nor the power of God, laying before us two books, or volumes of study, if we be secured from error. The first is the Scriptures, lost my place, revealing the will of God, and then the creatures, expressing his power, whereof the latter is key unto the former, opening up our belief and drawing us in to due meditation on the omnipotency of God, which is chiefly signed and engraved upon his works. Do you hear that? Understand what he's saying here? There are two books that God has written. One is Scripture, one is creation. And actually, to study creation is to open ourselves up. It's necessary to even approaching God's revelation in Scripture. Because it is by looking at creation and saying, wow, this is amazing. Somebody must have had to put this together. This can't be just one grand cosmic accident. By looking at creation in that way, we are opened up to see God's revelation in Scripture. So there's an interplay between the two of them. One more quote. But the greatest error of all the rest is the mistaking or misplacing of the last and furthest end of knowledge. So again, what's the point of all this knowledge? For men have entered into a desire of learning and knowledge, sometimes upon natural curiosity. The early modern folks really didn't like curiosity for curiosity's sake. And sometimes for inquisitive appetite. Sometimes to entertain their minds with variety and delight. Sometimes for ornament and reputation. And sometimes to enable them to victory of wit and contradiction, but most times for lucre and profession. We study to make money. And some seldomly, sincerely to give a true account for the gift of reason, to the benefit, to the use of all men. And women. As if there were sought in knowledge a couch whereupon to rest a searching and restless spirit, or a terrace for wandering and variable mind to walk up and down with a fair prospect, or a tower of state for a proud mind to rest itself upon, or a fort commanding ground for strife and contention, or a shop for profit and sale, and not a rich storehouse for the glory of the Creator and the relief of man's estate. Right, I've given you just a few snippets there of the way in which the theological imagine operates in Bacon's mind. Again, at this point, you'd see a wonderful slide of a rubber chicken in the snow. We would all laugh, so go ahead and have that too. And that's just to tell you one quick story that was often told about Bacon's death. That he was riding in a carriage from London to his country estate outside of London, because that was the real life, to get outside of the hustle and bustle of the city and to be out in the country. And he was all of a sudden had this eureka moment, and he yelled at the stagecoach driver, "Stop!" And they were passing this stand where they were selling chickens. He jumped out of the stagecoach and he bought one of the chickens, and he proceeded to take it out to the snow, because they had also experienced about 7 nor'easters in a row. And he took it to the snow, and he started stuffing the chicken with snow. It was a bad day for that chicken. And it was ordered to see if cold could possibly preserve as salt did. Right? This is before refrigerators. To see if cold could preserve like salt did. Unfortunately, he caught a cold, and then which turned into pneumonia, which was the cause of his death. So the way that this story is told is that here is Bacon, as really the first martyr to science, the first person who dies in pursuit of knowledge, and this new experimental natural philosophy, where you have a theory. Maybe there's the cold to preserve like salt does, and then you go test that theory, and then you would see what happens. It's probably not true. He was probably addicted to drugs. A lot of people were at that age, and probably died of an overdose. But still, it becomes an important part of the lore around Bacon. You'd also see at this point a nice frontispiece for one of his most important works called The New Atlantis. So you can imagine that right here. That's one of also the best books that if you want to go home and read Bacon today, I would recommend you read The New Atlantis, because it's sort of his vision of science and society. It's this, some people credit it as being the first scientific sci-fi. He's imagining all of these technologies that might help him do all the kinds of things that he was talking about and overcome the limits of creation. One of my favorite things here is he wants to see if it's possible to transmit a voice from one end through a string to the other end. And so you see here these two nice English gentlemen who are holding up what look like tin cans with a string between them, right? Whenever I'm teaching 18-year-olds, I say, "Do you know what that is?" And all of them say, "No, I've never seen one of those." Anybody of a certain age would say, "Oh, that's a telephone," right? So you have this incredible imagination for all of these technologies that would help us reclaim our place in creation. He's credited on the frontispiece of the book that was written by Thomas Sprat, an Anglican priest, on the history of the Royal Society in London, which was really the first experimental natural philosophy organization, and is still one of the world's most important scientific bodies. He is right there as the father of this Royal Society, these folks that would go tinkering in the natural world to try to understand it better. So then I would see if I can, at least for the folks in the front row here, I would go back to this whole bit about the conflict between science and religion. Can you see that okay? It's Jesus and Darwin really having at it there. And to say, well, what do we make of this by looking at just this one figure in terms of the history of science and religion? I will just say, in short, that if it was a relationship status on Facebook, that we would click, "It's complicated." That there have been various periods of conflict between religious authorities and between scientific figures, between the scientific worldview and a theological worldview. But there has also been this incredibly important relationship between the two as they grew up together in the early modern era. And I can give you 40 other examples of that, or I recommend 142 books that you can read on this subject. But I hope you'll just trust the one glimpse that I've given you in one figure in this era. Let me just close with what Bacon calls the writer's prayer. And it's a collect that he wrote in the form of our collects in our Book of Common Prayer. And then if we have time for any questions, then or comments, or refutations, we can take those too. That'd be great. The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Thou, O Father, who gavest the visible light as the firstborn of thy creatures, and didst pour into man the intellectual light as the top and consummation of thy workmanship. Be pleased to protect and govern this work, which coming from thy goodness returneth to thy glory. Thou, after thou hadst reviewed the works which thy hand had made, beheldest everything that was very good. Thou didst rest with complacency in them. But man, reflecting on the works which he made, saw that all was vanity and vexation of spirit, and could by no means acquiesce in them. Wherefore, if we labor in thy works with the sweat of our brows, thou wilt make us partakers of thy vision and thy Sabbath. We humbly beg that this mind may be steadfastly in us, and that thou, by our hands and also by the hands of others on whom thou shalt bestow the same Spirit, wilt please to convey a largeness of new alms to the family of mankind. These things we commend to thy everlasting love, by our Jesus, thy Christ, God with us. Amen. And there's a really funny picture of Bacon with a pig nose on himself. There. So cue laughter once more. Thank you very much. Yes?
All right. I kept thinking about the nuclear bomb. There was weapons of destruction in Francis Bacon's time. What would he think of God's purpose in the creation of a destructive mechanism?
That is a wonderful question. I will pay you afterwards. Because one of the things that I will say is Bacon has a really optimistic view of technology and the human ability to use it. What he perhaps didn't think about so much, he thought so much about the chaos of creation, the effects of the fall in the human mind, but it didn't necessarily take into account human sinfulness and the ability of us to both create incredible technologies that help us fly all over the world, help us Skype with our grandkids and see a video. I remember when I was a kid, I was watching Nickelodeon and they were advertising a new technology of a video phone, and I thought, whoa! And now I can FaceTime with my daughter anytime I want. So we have this incredible ability to create these amazing technologies that do all sorts of wonderful things for us. And we have the incredible ability to create the most destructive technologies that have been known to humankind. Where instead of the power of everybody else becomes the power of some over other people. The accumulation of power in the hands of the few, right? So at least for Bacon, he didn't necessarily foresee quite as much. He had a very optimistic view that we would just create all kinds of new technologies, and that would just help us address all of these terrible effects of the fall. And indeed they have. We've lengthened our lives by how many decades compared to Bacon's time. But we've also created these technologies with incredible destructive potential, both to the human body, and I would argue to the human soul. In any account for how are we to relate to our technologies, I think we have to address human sin, and perhaps more robustly than Bacon did. Yes?
Don't you imagine, at least a little bit, that the references to the sweat of the brow and what happened during the fall allowed him to contemplate sin, and that what he was, I think, and I take on it especially from the prayer, what he was getting at was the development of the mind, the development of the technologies, the use of it for the benefit of well-being, but the contemplation from the mind changing the heart to regain the position we were in before the fall.
Yes.
Human character has been poisoned, and of the thought process is to change the heart and character, to elevate.
You got it. Yes, one person was listening. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, and so I would say it's not that he doesn't have an account of sin. Obviously, the figure is really prominently in his whole vision of this. Here is again as a big Scrabble word, the post-lapsarian human condition, after-fall human condition. It's just that I think he's if you're asking me, in my opinion, that Bacon is sometimes overly optimistic about the extent to which, if we just got the science right and the technology right, everything else will fall into place. And I want to say, well, it's certainly done a lot of really good stuff for us. I really appreciate a lot of the technologies that we have. But it isn't the thing that's going to get us through at the end of the day. And that there's something else that's missing. And that's what the Roman Catholic bishops in the encyclical tradition call integral human development. It's not just the development of technologies, indeed economic development, but it's also a development of the human spirit that is fed as much by the sacraments, and by Scripture, and by God's grace manifest to us in the church, as it is by technology. The technology alone isn't going to help us. We're not going to get out of life alive. And I'm not sure that Bacon has thought about that piece, or talked about it as much as... But sin figures prominently, even in the vanity, everything is vanity stuff. It is a reminder to us, you could say, and sort of his safeguard on the project of what science and technology could do, that at the end of the day, it's all vanity. We're all going to die. And so we might prolong our life, and that's great, and we might make our life easier. That's great. We now have the Roomba vacuums that vacuum our house for us, right? That's wonderful. We need to get one of those, by the way. And that's all good stuff, but it's not the ultimate good. And Bacon reserves room for that. Yeah, one more question. Yes?
You mentioned the atomic bomb and the Manhattan Project and, the terrible wrath of an atomic reaction. I read recently that the genesis of the atomic bomb during the Manhattan Project, most of the engineers and physicists and geniuses involved believed that it was good. They believed that it would create peace, lower the amount of wars, etc., and then later found the dark side of atomic weapons. The same goes for a lot of technology. We first find the beauty of the technology, the convenience of the technology, and then boom, we find there's a dark side. Facebook is great, Facebook is neat, until a child's mind is ruined by Facebook, or they become depressed, or they attempt suicide, or whatever it may be. Could it, in fact, be God judging technology? God saying, hey, this is a neat idea, human, but I'm still in charge, and here's the dark side.
Once again, I'll pay you after this.
I'll take a PhD.
One of the slides that you did not see here is the story of the Tower of Babel. It's one that I always think about with reference to science and technology, where the humans thought, you know what, forget all this, like, going to God in the way that God suggested it. Let's just build a really big tower. Right? Do you remember the story? And then God cursed the attempt of humans after they built this grand tower and confused their languages. And so the humans could no longer coordinate in quite that same way and sort of dispersed. It's a wonderful story. And I think the reminder to us is, where I would rest with it, is that, again, human efforts, as Bacon would say, are only going to get us so far. These are good things. Facebook is a wonderful thing, I guess. I kind of hate Facebook, but it does certain things. It helps us connect, and it does all this stuff. But it only gets us so far, and as you say, there is a dark side to all of these technologies. I've talked with another talk in the can that I have for another day. It's just about our cell phones and about how the electrolytic converters in our cell phones are mined from a mine in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which has been in a state of basically perpetual civil war. 6 million people killed. 6 million people killed in civil wars over in the DRC. And much of that war has been funded by mining some of the materials that we need to run our cell phones. So our cell phones are great to the extent that they help us connect, but there's also a dark side to these technologies. And what we need is to try to use them faithfully and well, and also ever submit ourselves to the grace of God that is at work in our lives, that is bringing us to a completion that science and technology can never bring us to. We'll have a good day. Thank you very much.